Okay. Okay, we're still in Ezra, and now we're up to week 6. At the end of last week's session, Terry brought up about when we read the decree from Darius that he had added support out of the royal treasuries, and some discussion came up about what Cyrus had said in the beginning, and then what Darius did, and that the Jewish people got a boost by getting from the royal treasury. And so when I got home last week, I started looking around, and back in the first chapter, it does say that Cyrus urged the Jews to return and obliges the people of his kingdom to supply them with what they need for the temple and for worship. And it doesn't really say that they give them money, but and of course they took out of the treasury. They took they talked about silver and gold, but I think that was mostly the vessels that they had taken. And then when you move over to chapter 5, when Tetnai sends the letter to Darius, he talks about it says in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, it says these verses essentially repeat information found in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. But the report stops short of claiming that Cyrus had also commanded that the building be funded by donations from Babylon. He didn't really come out and say it that far. But then when we get over to chapter 6 and verse 4, which we read last week, it talked about, it says, while the original decree had required people in Babylon to support the cost of the exiles project, in Ezra 1:4, this record that we read here requires that the cost be met from the royal treasury. So, yeah, I think it doesn't really say that in verses 1 and in chapter 4, or chapter 1 and chapter 4, but definitely here Darius does spend some of the taxpayers' money on the Jews, so to speak. So, okay. It prompted me to go back and reread what I had done. Thank you. I think I learned more than probably you guys do, but that's the way it is. So we stopped, last week we stopped, I was going to go into stage 3. There's 3 stages. The first stage was the Jews migrating back to Judah. And then the second phase was the work was started. And now phase 3 is we're going to talk about the work being completed. It says on the 12th day of the last month of 515 BC, the temple was completed. About 70 years from the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586, and about 5.5 years after Haggai and Zechariah called the people back to work in chapter 5, verse 1. God had been faithful to care for his people, and he provided encouragement through the preaching of the prophets, and even used the authority and wealth of the King Darius, or the pagan king, or however you want to do this, to further the work. So we're going to pick up in chapter 6, verses 13 through 18. Let's see, 13. So then, according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-boznai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. And the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai and the prophet Zechariah, the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of the house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering, for all Israel, 12 male goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as is written in the book of Moses. Let's see, I guess my notes go backwards here. So the dedication of the temple described in verses 16 through 18, there was a conscious comparison with Solomon's dedication of the first temple in 1 Kings 8. The temple is called the house of God, and there is a large number of fellowship offerings. The 100 bulls, the 200 rams, and the 400 male lambs here are much less than what was offered in 1 Kings, but this is a smaller group of people in comparison. These are fellowship offerings in which only small portions were burned in sacrifice. The meat is eaten by the people in a joyous feast together before the Lord. So there wasn't any ark there. There was no ark in the Holy of Holies, and no glory filled the house. The temple, even though they didn't have those, the temple was still dedicated to the Lord because it was His house, built for His glory. Instead of weeping over what they didn't have, the Jews rejoiced over what they did have, and this is always attitude of faith. Now, when King Solomon dedicated the temple that he built, he offered so many sacrifices that it couldn't be counted. And in 1 Kings 8:5, it says, "And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered." Was plus 142,000 peace offerings, which were shared with the people. And in 1 Kings 8:63, it says, Solomon offered it as a peace offering to the Lord 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. The Jewish remnant now offered only 712 sacrifices, but the Lord accepted them. Most important, they offered 12 male goats as sin offerings for each tribe, because they wanted the Lord to forgive their sins and to give them a new beginning. Joshua, the high priest, also consecrated the priests and the Levites for their ministry in the completed temple. Now, David had organized the priests into 24 courses or divisions so that they could minister more effectively. In 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 through 19, it lists the priests and sons back in King David's time, David's time. They drew lots to set up the divisions. It wasn't necessary for them all to serve the temple at the same time, for each course or each division was assigned its week of ministry in the temple. In Luke 1, verses 5, in verse 5, it says, "In the days of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth." And then when you skip forward to verse 8, it says, "And now while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty." So we know from history that they were assigned, not everybody was doing it at the same time. There was different days of the week, I suppose, or different weeks of the year. The statement in verse 18 that I read that says, "As it is written in the law of Moses," refers to the consecration of the priests and not their organization. Picking up in verse 19. On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together. All of them were clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles and for their fellow priests and for themselves. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. And they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So the Passover was just a few weeks after the initial dedication, and the Jews gathered in their families to remember how God had delivered them from bondage in Egypt back in Exodus. Each year, the Jewish men were required to make 3 trips to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. But during their years in exile, the hearts of the Jews must have yearned for the day when they once again were free to go to their holy city and worship God. The leaders invited all the Jews and Jewish proselytes to share in the Passover, even those who couldn't prove their lineage, as long as the males were circumcised and had separated themselves from the paganism of the people of the land. And they were welcome. It speaks well of the Jewish remnant that they reached out in this way and didn't try to establish an exclusive holier-than-thou fellowship. The temple had been dedicated, and now the people were dedicating themselves to the Lord. During the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Jews had to remove all yeast or leaven from their dwellings. A picture of personal purification. To a Jew, yeast was a symbol of evil, so Passover was a time to put away all the evil from their lives. What good is a dedicated temple if you don't have dedicated people? Once again, Jewish worship would take place in the holy city in a restored temple dedicated to the Lord. No wonder the people were rejoicing. And it was all because of the faithfulness of God. He had turned the heart of the king, King Darius and King Cyrus, to assist the people, and now the work was completed. Proverbs 21, verse 1 says, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will." So no matter what our circumstances may be, we can trust God to be faithful. Great is thy faithfulness isn't just a verse to quote or a song to sing. It is a glorious truth to believe and to act upon, no matter how difficult the situation in life might be. Psalms 89 says, "I will sing of the mercies of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations." Soon after backing up to verse, the section 19 through 22, it says, "Soon after the dedication of the temple, the people celebrate the Passover," beginning in 619. And the text is written in Hebrew, and a portion in Aramaic ends in verse 18. It is calculated, according to our calendar, that the temple was completed on March 12th, 515 BC, and the Passover would have begun on April 21st. So only a few weeks after the dedication of the temple, the Jews had another important celebration, which we just talked about. The celebrations were important in the life of the Jews. These gatherings gave them opportunity to worship together, to remember God's great works throughout their history, to be taught from the law, and to have joyous times of fellowship. The Passover celebrated their deliverance from the bondage of Egypt, as I'd said earlier, and the events of the Exodus from Egypt left a lasting effect on Israel. And although the Jews celebrated the Passover every year, it is usually mentioned in relation to some important event in Israel's life. In Numbers 9:5, it was after the crossing of the Red Sea. And then in Joshua 5:10, there was the crossing into the Jordan River, to crossing into the land of Canaan in Joshua. And then in 2 Kings, they celebrated the year of King Josiah. And in 2 Chronicles, there was a revival movement under Hezekiah. And in Chronicles 35, there was a revival movement under Josiah. The revival movement under Hezekiah and under Josiah are both closely linked to the Passover celebration. It was very important for the priests and the Levites to be ceremonially clean to lead in the celebration of Passover, as prescribed in Exodus 29 and Numbers 8. This involved a rather complicated process of washing, sacrifice, and anointing. In fact, in Hezekiah's time, the people had to delay the Passover a month because they lacked sufficient ceremonially pure priests. And that was in 2 Chronicles 30. The statement, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors in order to seek the Lord, needs some explanation. The returned exiles are not only Jews in Judah at this time. Wait a minute. The returned exiles are not the only Jews in Judah at this time. Although the Babylonians carried most of the people away captive, some were left in Judah. Other Jews may have lived in the neighboring regions. No doubt many had accepted the custom of their neighbors. The zeal and dedication of the returned exiles draw them back to Judah and to the faith of their fathers. The Jewish leaders at this time seem very strict, but they are willing to accept these Jews who were not exiled to Babylon if these Jews definitely decide to follow the law of Moses. And that's two basic decisions they got to make. They must separate themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, and they must seek the Lord, which implies a sincere attitude of worship and obedience to God. And these decisions are similar to those that every Christian must make. That of following Christ has ethical implications. It implies renouncing what is displeasing to God. It also means seeking God, walking with the Lord in obedience, and follow where he leads. This first section of Ezra concludes on a note of victory and thanksgiving for what God has done in verse 22. The people worship God with joy during this whole week of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Okay, that takes us through chapter 6. Anybody got any comment? Ted?
I don't remember details on all of this history, but I do remember a little that I think is important. The glory of God entered the temple in Exodus chapter 40. And it said that it left in Ezekiel somewhere around chapters 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. And you just mentioned here, and I think I agree with it, that the temple was rebuilt, people were excited, they started initiating the temple, things they were supposed to do according to what Moses said. But the glory of God did not enter that temple again. And I don't think it entered it again until Jesus came back, and he was the one that re-entered that temple. And I'm not even sure exactly how, but I know that that's got to be significant.
That significant that God didn't enter the temple
God did not come back, the glory did not come back
in the glory.
once it was rebuilt.
Okay, until Jesus. It could be.
He was the one that went back inside.
Bill,
Yes.
there's a variety of discussion about what that means when it says the glory of God. In the early part of the Old Testament, it isn't exactly clear. It appears to be in some way a miracle, but it doesn't specify. But it does connect it to there being like a cloud, what we might call not mist, but a fog, that you couldn't see clearly because of that being in there, and the people may have interpreted that to be correctly, that this was God's showing his presence because of there being a cloud there. Now that we know there was a cloud above it during the movement through the 40 years that they were in the journey,
Right.
but I'm not sure if the text actually says the glory was the cloud, but it was something that said to people that that was where God came, and that was where they were supposed to worship.
It also says, though, in Exodus, I'm pretty sure, that when God's glory entered, Moses had to get out. So at that point, only the priests could go in.
Okay.
Nobody else, not even Moses. So it was something significant, whatever it was. And it left at the time of Ezekiel because of the prophecy of Israel being so bad they were going to get taken into captivity. So there's an implication there, it seems, that even though they came back, God's glory didn't come back. And it wouldn't come back until the sun came.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Barry?
Sure.
Okay.
It isn't specified, but the glory was something. It was something visible, and proof to them that God was there.
I
And it impressed them greatly.
I think it was proof, but I think it is also approval.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and that's approval, I think, is the more important word.
Okay,
Yep.
Yep, okay.
Completely separate thing
All right.
than that. I may have missed it, but I've been reading through this, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Haggai, and all of that. But there's something that's missing here that's important too. Well, let's think for a minute. Moses was around 1500 AD, BC, and this is 500 BC. For 1,000 years, one of the real problems that the Jews had in being faithful to God was idolatry.
right.
Maybe I missed it, but I don't think there's any mention of idolatry or God condemning them for idolatry or the teaching against idolatry in Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah. Like I said, I may have missed it. I even looked down to Malachi, which is the very tail end, and I don't think it's there, which says to me that the Jews were having a problem relearning what the law of Moses said and relearning what they were expected to do, and having the priests and having the Levites doing their job and showing up for the sacrifices. But it seems like that in the 70 years that they were gone, that they kind of cut themselves off from idolatry, and it wasn't such a problem after they came back. If I'm wrong, somebody tell me where.
Yeah, I don't remember reading about idolatry. It was more of not mixing with the Canaanites, the mixed marriages and stuff like that. I don't remember him talking about idolatry at all in here. You're right.
And the other peoples around them were still idolaters.
True.
And that, I think, was pretty clear, one reason why he said don't intermarry, because that meant you were going to get mixed up in the religions of the people around you.
Correct.
You know?
Right.
But it seems like here, Ezra and Nehemiah that we're reading here, the Jews were not so tempted as they had been in the past to go after idols. Maybe they had actually learned their lesson on that.
Okay. Right.
Timeline-wise, does any of the Chronicles fit into those prophets' times?
Now, the
I don't
Chronicles
remember.
kind of end with the beginning of the exile to Babylon, more of those.
Right. I think you're right on that. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So now we're going to move on into chapter 7. Chapter 7 begins the second state of the rebuilding of the community in this Ezra, Nehemiah section that we're working on. It's been 57 years have passed since the accounts in chapters 5 and 6. So we move forward 57 years when we get to chapter 7. The author does not, who is Ezra, does not pretend to give a complete history of the period. Rather, he chooses the events that were significant for the continuation of the Jewish community. And here is where Ezra actually, we're going to start talking about Ezra himself. I mean, all this beforehand he wrote, but kind of telling the history of what had happened up to now. Now we're going to get to talking about Ezra in the first person here, if I remember my notes correctly here. So now we're getting up to Ezra. It says, when talk show hosts or hostesses ask successful people the secret of their great achievements, the answers they get are varied and sometimes contradictory. Some successful people will give credit to their sobriety and personal discipline, while others will boast that they lived just the way they pleased, whether anybody liked it or not. I always maintain my integrity is counterbalanced by I pushed my way to the top, no matter who got stepped on. But if we could interview Ezra, and asked him the secret of his successful life, he would probably have said humbly, "The good hand of the Lord was upon me." And that phrase is found 6 times in Ezra chapter 7 and 8. 7, Ezra 7:6, at the end of verse 6, I've highlighted and read, "And the hand of the Lord, his God, was upon him." And then in 7:9, "The good hand of the Lord was upon him." In 7:28, again, talks about the hand of the Lord being upon him, and Ezra 8:18, according to the good hand of our God.
What's that mean?
What does the phrase mean?
Yeah, what is the hand of the Lord being on him? What's that mean?
That he's being guided by God. I think that's the way I took it. I mean, that God guided him in his work. Is that what you don't think that says that?
No, I think it's right, but it says,
Oh, you mean what the whole?
well, like, apparently he was respected by other people because of this. And it kind of says to me that it was, I hate to say the word visible, but it was in some way known to them that God was guiding him. And I did find a verse in the chapter, we're a little ahead, in chapter 7, verse 25. "And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God, which is in your hand." And this is said by, apparently, the king, Artaxerxes, because he's giving Ezra authority to do things. At the end of the verse, it says, "And you may teach anyone who is ignorant of them." So, somehow, I think that maybe Ezra is considered to be somewhat like a prophet, that God was obviously guiding him, and it caused other people to understand that, and that they would follow him. And Ezra was a scribe.
He was scribe, right? Yeah.
He was skilled in the law of Moses.
It was, yes.
He was respected, and he's a leader.
Yes, because he studied the law of Moses, and when he eventually gets to Jerusalem, I mean, he tries to teach the people about the law of Moses, because he was an expert in that field. But yeah, okay. Let's see. And again, in Ezra 8:22 and 8:31, it talks about the hand of God being on Ezra. Nothing but the blessing of God can explain how an obscure Jewish priest and scholar, born in Babylonian captivity, and I think we talked about this early on when we first started this study, that some people didn't realize that Ezra was, he was born in captivity. He knew nothing about Israel. Yes. Well, what'd you say, Ted? No, did you say no? No. I think so, but I don't know if it's the same thing. Anybody else? Did you hear what she was asking?
Yeah, I'd say yes.
You think yes? Okay.
Not specifically, it doesn't explicitly say it, but we're talking about God here. God is one, and God functions in 3 personalities. So it was the leadership of God in some fashion. And that could be called the Spirit, or it could be called the leadership of the Father, or even the Son.
Which one are you reading? Oh, is favorable disposed to all those who seek him, but his power and his anger are against all those who forsake him. It,
That part's kind of talking about protection, right? So it's got sort of blessing his mission or his journey in each of those cases. So it becomes apparent that this is an initiative that God is in favor of. And so along the way, as Ezra presents himself to different groups, and here he's saying, I could have asked for protection, but it was my sense that God was going to take care of us because he was the one who sent us on this mission. But how he did that, through what personality he did that, I don't know if it's specifically said, but I think Ezra's purpose in going back and leading the people was at the behest of God. God gave him this mission to go on.
right.
So it seems like
And-
in this case, he's just reaffirming that what I'm doing because God has sent me to do this work, and God's blessing him along the way with protection and wisdom and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think you could certainly, I think any of us could sort of say, yeah, I believe I'm in the right mission, and God's giving me some direction. It's just, and maybe that's what the Spirit does, it's kind of guiding us, the Spirit guiding us, helping us through challenges in our life. And
True,
so
yeah.
I think in that perspective, it's easy to say, well, by reading and praying and fellowshipping, we gain information and strength, and that's kind of the Spirit in a calm way.
I think when you look at it that way, because I guess you could say that if you're doing the right things and whatnot, that the God of hand could be on you also. Is that what you're kind of asking? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So he was born in the Babylonian captivity, and he accomplished so much for God and Israel when so much was working against him. That God's good hand was upon this man doesn't minimize the importance of his personal piety or his great ability as a scholar, nor does it ignore the great help that King Artaxerxes gave him. And even Artaxerxes was Artaxerxes Longinus, whatever it is. Anyway, it's the Latin term is Artaxerxes the long-handed. He may have been called long-handed because of his great authority reached out so far. I mean, he controlled everything that was from Egypt all the way across to India. So he had great authority over all that. So that's why they kind of called him the long-handed, because reached so far. Okay, or because he was generous. Also, or it could be because he was generous to his subjects. But it was God's hand that moved the king's hand to sign the edict that enabled Ezra to take the remnant of Jews to their land to serve the Lord. Now, this will be the second or third batch that he's going to take to Israel. God uses all kinds of people to accomplish His will. But if God's hand isn't at work in us and through us, nothing will be accomplished. It's the principle Jesus taught his disciples in John 15:5. It says, "Without me, you can do nothing." What God did for the people of Israel during those difficult days after the Babylonian captivity. It was the year 458 BC, and Artaxerxes I was king of Persia, and he was king between 465 and 424. Nearly 60 years had passed since the completion of the temple in Jerusalem, and the Jewish remnant was having a very difficult time. It was then that God raised up Ezra to lead a second group of refugees to Babylon, to Judah, from Babylon to Judah, to bring financial and spiritual support to the work and to help rebuild the city. Every person is important to God and God's work. But as Dr. Lee Roberson, he lived from 1909 to 2007. He was the founder of the Tennessee Temple University in Chattanooga, often said, everything rises and falls with leadership. When God wanted to deliver Israel from Egypt, he raised up Moses and Aaron. When Israel was divided and defeated, he called Samuel to teach the word and David to serve as king. Richard Nixon was right when he said the leaders are people who make a difference, and Ezra was that kind of man. When God wants to judge a nation, he sends them inferior leaders. Inferior leaders, and if you read back in Isaiah 3, verses 1 through 8, we find some of that. But when he wants to bless them, he sends men like Ezra. I'm going to stop here because this next section is going to be longer than I can do in 5 minutes. So, yes, Ted.
Go back to what Sherry asked.
Okay.
I found something that I didn't know. It says that the hand of the Lord in Hebrew is actually a word, Y-A-M-A-N, Yaman, which expresses a close relation, close friendship with God, sharing your heart with Him and He with you. It is sharing secrets with Him and as He shares divine revelation with you. That's kind of what this guy's saying, the meaning of that word is, that makes that English phrase.
Okay. Did you get that? Okay. Anybody else got any other comments before we close up shop here? Okay. Thank you.